of Kingley is a small town tucked away from civilization. It's the type of small town where everybody knows each other and your neighbors know all your secrets. Nothing really happens in Kingley. The local newspaper was on the brink of bankruptcy. That was until November 1, 2018, when an event so shocking and scandalous, it rocked the small town to its core. It was a normal day in Kingley, nothing out of the ordinary. Sally Jones was outside her dentist's office, waiting for her husband Ben's treatment to finish. She was reading one of those sports magazines in the reception and was enthralled in the various articles on various sports people. It had been 45 minutes and she started to feel uneasy. You see, Dr. Eve Johnson was never this slow with her treatment. She decided to wait another 15 minutes. And then she started to realize that the sounds of suction and instruments had stopped. She decided to go investigate. And what she found shocked her to her core and made her body numb. She found Dr. Eve Johnson unconscious on the floor. But even more shocking to Sally was her husband Ben on the chair, laying there lifeless. Dr. Eve Johnson had a big gash on her head, with blood trickling down her forehead. But Ben had no blood. He just lay there, unconscious and lifeless. Sally got down onto her knees. She couldn't move. She felt a cold shiver go down her spine. And then she let out a loud scream. This led to the other patients running into the office, into this unsightly scene. As this laid the scene for the town's most traumatic story of all time, the infamous story of the Tooth Slayer. Detectives Xavier and Chang arrived on the scene, and what they saw shocked them. Dr. Eve Johnson had gotten up, but she did not remember anything that happened. She didn't know how she got the gash to the head. She didn't know how Ben died. She didn't know why her window was wide open. All she could do was cry and just sit there. Sally Jones was still numb, still reeling from the loss that she had just experienced. Detective Xavier went up to Sally Jones and decided to ask her a few questions. Sally could not answer. She just stood there with her eyes wide open. Detective Xavier decided to tell her to go home. And then he shifted his focus back on Eve Johnson. He kept prodding away at her, trying to figure out if she could give him an answer. But she too was no help. He looked at her with suspicion, and then told her to go home, but warned her not to leave town. Detectives Chang and Xavier then left the scene. While sitting at the police station, Detective Xavier and Chang have a conversation about the scene. Detective Chang is adamant that Eve Johnson is not a suspect, but something in Xavier's mind tells him that they should be looking at the dentist. He decides to leave and take a drive down to the dental office of Eve Johnson. When he arrives, he investigates the scene even further, looking for clues. He turns the place upside down, looks through all the drawers, all the bins, And when he can't find something, he begins to reel. He has an obsession with finding the truth, finding answers. He looks again and then sits down on the floor and tries to contemplate how to move forward until something catches his eye. He finds 5 ampules of local anesthetic in the garbage. For some reason this stood out to him. For some reason he felt this was a clue. He takes out a little plastic bag from his pocket and he puts these ampules inside. He then stands up and something else catches his eye. It is a box. A box with all of Eve Johnson's patient files. He gets on his knees and contemplates opening this confidential information. He knows the rules. He knows what could happen if he's found out. But he decides to open it anyway. And what he finds inside shocks him. The file of Ben Jones is missing, which leaves an even bigger question mark in his head. He closes the box, leaves the dental office into his car, and he drives straight to Eve Johnson's apartment. As he arrives at Eve Johnson's apartment, questions swirl in his head, and he asks himself if he thinks that Eve Johnson could be a suspect in this murder. He asks himself about the situation and how she conveniently couldn't remember any of the information. He then goes up the stairs with all these questions in his head, and as he gets in front of her door, he knocks hesitantly. Eve Johnson opens the door. It is very visible that she has been crying. Detective Xavier asks to come in, and Eve lets him in. He then sits down on her couch. She offers him some water, and he declines. She then sits adjacent to him. Detective Xavier thinks for a while, and then reaches into his pocket to show Eve the ampules of local anesthetic. She's able to explain her way out of it. She explains that it's normal procedure for her to use local anesthetic on her patients, and that all those ampules were divided between 3 patients. Still something in Xavier's head clicks. He still feels like she's hiding something, but he decides to put the ampules back into his pocket. He then looks straight at her again and asks her point blank, "Did you murder Ben Jones?" She begins to tear up again and says no. Xavier looks her in the eye for a few minutes and then decides to leave her alone. He then stands up and thanks her for her time and then reaches for the door. He looks back one more time and decides to ask her about the missing patient file. She's visibly confused and laments that she did not take the file. Again, Xavier looks at her with suspicion, but decides to leave the scene. Back at Xavier's apartment, he can't shake the feeling that Eve Johnson is the person he's looking for. He tosses and turns in his bed and cannot sleep. He stays up the whole night thinking about the murder scene, thinking about the conversation he just had with Eve Johnson, and thinking about the details of the case. He then gets 1 hour of sleep before it's 6 o'clock in the morning and his routine starts. At 7 a.m., he's headed to work. As he arrives at the police station, he goes straight for Detective Chung, his partner. He then asks Chung if she thinks that Eve Johnson could have committed this murder. Chung tells him that there is no evidence that could point to her, and she mentions that Eve was in worse shape. She then mentions that Eve was in worse shape than Ben Jones. Detective Xavier then leaves to go back to the crime scene, but his eye is caught by the medical examiner, who's pointing at him and telling him to come. He then goes to the medical examiner's office. As he sees Ben Jones on the table, the medical examiner tells him something that helps him confirm his suspicion. It turns out Ben Jones was severely allergic to adrenaline. The first thing Xavier does is he takes out the plastic of local anesthetics and shows it to the medical examiner, who confirms that all those ampules of local anesthetic had adrenaline in them. His next instinct is to drive straight back to the dental office. He arrives there and looks through the office again. Eve Johnson is not around, but a receptionist is. He walks straight to the receptionist and asks him about Eve Johnson's whereabouts. He replies he doesn't know, and then Xavier asks a follow-up question about Ben Jones's file. He also did not know where that file went. And then one last question to confirm Xavier's suspicions. Did Eve Johnson know that Ben Jones was allergic to adrenaline at the time of the treatment? The receptionist reluctantly answered yes. Everything started to fall into place for Detective Xavier. The receptionist confirmed something else. That Ben Jones was the only patient who Eve Johnson saw yesterday. And finally Xavier had all the proof he needed to arrest Eve Johnson. He then rushed to Eve Johnson's apartment, breaking several laws of the road. And then as he arrived at the apartment, he ran up the stairs, knocked on Eve Johnson's door, but there was no answer. He knocked again vigorously, still no answer. He then breaks down the door and looks around the room. Eve Johnson is nowhere to be found. He checks the bedroom, he checks the toilet. Still no Eve Johnson in sight. He makes a phone call to the police station. This phone call is to his partner, Detective Chung, telling her that Eve Johnson just skipped town and she was the #1 murder suspect in the murder of Ben Jones. He then walks up to the kitchen counter and finds what he was looking for all this time, the patient file of Ben Jones. He then opens up the patient file and finds a picture of Ben Jones' face, but it has been desecrated with marker. On his forehead it's written, "He deserved to die."